Professor Vex-Theta adjusted his four compound eyes and clicked his mandibles in what passed for satisfaction among his species. Today's advanced xenobiology lesson would surely traumatize at least half the class. Perfect. Nothing built character quite like watching privileged academy students wet themselves at the sight of genuine danger. The lecture hall buzzed with nervous chatter from 24 sentient beings representing the finest educational institutions across the Galactic Federation. Crystalline-based silicoids tinkled like wind chimes, while the gaseous nebulons whispered in frequencies that made everyone else's teeth ache. Standard Tuesday morning chaos, really. Silence, larvae! Vex-Theta's voice cracked like a whip across the amphitheater. 24 beings immediately shut up, except for one creature in the back row who seemed utterly fascinated by something stuck under his fingernail. The human? Of course. Marcus Kane, if the professor's memory served correctly. Earth specimen, bipedal, annoyingly persistent in asking questions nobody wanted answered. The kind of student who made educators question their career choices. Today, we examine survival scenarios involving apex predators from the Forbidden Zones, Vex-Theta announced, his voice dripping with the kind of dramatic flair that had made him legendary among his peers. Specifically, creatures so lethal that encountering them typically results in immediate, agonizing death. A collective shudder rippled through the classroom. The silicoid in the front row actually started vibrating at a frequency that suggested imminent panic. Excellent. Professor Vex-Theta reached into his secure containment unit, a device that required 3 separate biometric scans and a prayer to whatever gods watched over foolish educators. His claws clicked against the reinforced transparasteel as he withdrew the first specimen. "Behold," he said, raising the container high enough for everyone to see, "the Mordian death wasp, native to the toxic swamps of Kepler 442b. This delightful creature possesses venom capable of dissolving organic matter from the inside out. One sting delivers enough neurotoxin to drop a full-grown Goliath bear in under 30 seconds. The classroom fell silent, except for the soft whimpering of a particularly sensitive aquarian, whose gills had turned a sickly shade of green. The wasp itself was a nightmare made manifest. 8 inches of pure malevolence, with wings that buzzed like chainsaws, and a stinger that gleamed with toxic promise. Its compound eyes reflected the classroom lights with an intelligence that suggested it was actively planning everyone's demise. "The Mordian death wasp," Vex-Theta continued, clearly enjoying himself, "has been responsible for wiping out 3 separate colonization attempts. Its sting causes immediate paralysis, followed by liquefaction of internal organs, and finally, if you're particularly unlucky, complete cellular breakdown, while the victim remains conscious throughout the entire process." A Felinian student in the 3rd row actually fainted, toppling backward with a soft thud. Nobody moved to help him. They were all too busy staring at the container with the kind of morbid fascination typically reserved for transportation accidents. "Now," the professor said, setting down the first container and reaching for another, "let me introduce you to something even more delightful. The vegan scorpion-spider hybrid from Proxima Centauri C. This specimen was worse than the first. About the size of a dinner plate, it possessed the worst characteristics of both arachnids and arthropods. 8 legs covered in barbed spines, pincers that could probably cut through battle armor, and a tail that curved over its back like a question mark from hell. These charming creatures," Vex-Theta explained, "hunt in packs of 50 or more. Their venom doesn't kill immediately. Oh no, that would be merciful. Instead, it induces a state of complete sensory overload. Every nerve ending in the victim's body fires simultaneously, creating pain levels that register off our measurement scales. Death typically occurs from cardiac arrest, brought on by sheer agony, though some victims have been known to claw their own eyes out first. The classroom had gone from nervous to genuinely terrified. Half the students were openly staring at the exits, calculating distances and wondering if their species' particular brand of locomotion would be sufficient for escape. Finally, Professor Vex-Theta said, producing a third container with theatrical flourish, "I present the crown jewel of today's lesson, the nightmare centipede of Tau Ceti F. This thing defied description while simultaneously demanding it. 3 feet long, with segments that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns designed to hypnotize prey. Its legs moved in waves like liquid death, and its head bore mandibles that looked capable of chewing through starship hull plating. The nightmare centipede, Vex-Theta said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, secretes a hallucinogenic compound through its skin. Victims experience their worst fears made manifest, while the creature slowly devours them, starting with the extremities and working inward. The process can take hours, days in some cases. The silence in the classroom was so complete, it had weight. Even the air filtration system seemed to be holding its breath. And then, from the back row, a hand went up. Professor Vex-Theta's compound eyes swiveled to focus on the human with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested internal screaming. "Yes, Kane?" he asked, already regretting the question. Marcus Kane straightened in his seat, completely unperturbed by the 3 containers of concentrated nightmare sitting on the professor's desk. His expression held the sort of casual interest typically reserved for examining cafeteria lunch options. "So," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the silent classroom, "are any of those edible?" The question hit the room like a physical force. Every being in the amphitheater turned to stare at the human, with expressions ranging from disbelief to horror to what might generously be called existential crisis. Professor Vex-Theta felt his grip on the 3rd container waver slightly. In 47 years of teaching, across 17 different species and countless scenarios designed to inspire appropriate fear responses, no student had ever asked if the nightmare fuel was suitable for consumption. "I'm sorry," Vex-Theta said, his voice climbing an octave. "Could you repeat that question?" "Sure," Marcus replied cheerfully, apparently immune to the stunned stares of his classmates. "I was wondering if any of those things are edible. You know, safe for human consumption. They look pretty meaty." The silicoid in the front row started making a sound like crystal wind chimes being fed through a wood chipper. The aquarian's gills had progressed from green to a sort of purplish gray that suggested imminent system shutdown. "Kane," Professor Vex-Theta said slowly, "these are apex predators from the most dangerous worlds in known space. They are not food items. They are instruments of death, harbingers of doom, creatures so lethal that entire planets have been quarantined to contain them." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if this information was being carefully filed away for future reference. "Right, but that doesn't really answer my question," he said. "I mean, on Earth, we eat lobsters, and those things look like alien monsters to most people. We eat scorpions in some places, spiders too, in certain regions, and plenty of things that could kill us if we're not careful about preparation. So I'm just wondering about the nutritional value here." Professor Vex-Theta set down the 3rd container with extreme care, mostly because his hands had started trembling. He was beginning to understand why humans had such a terrifying reputation in certain corners of the galaxy. "The Mordian death wasp," he said, attempting to regain control of his lesson, "possesses venom that can dissolve organic tissue." "So did the fugu fish back on Earth," Marcus countered. "Didn't stop people from eating it. Just had to know how to prepare it properly." "What's the venom delivery system on that wasp? Is it just in the stinger, or distributed throughout the body?" The classroom had gone beyond silent. It had achieved a state of quiet that suggested the fundamental laws of physics were considering resignation. "The venom," Professor Vex-Theta heard himself saying, "is primarily concentrated in specialized glands near the stinger mechanism. The rest of the body contains lower concentrations, though still sufficient to cause severe tissue damage." "Interesting," Marcus said, leaning forward in his seat. "So potentially, you could harvest the non-venomous parts if you knew what you were doing." "What? About the scorpion spider thing? Similar situation?" Professor Vex-Theta realized he was sweating, which was particularly concerning since his species didn't possess sweat glands. "The vegan scorpion-spider hybrid secretes venom through specialized ducts in its pincers and tail," he found himself explaining. "The main body cavity contains significantly less toxic material." "And the centipede?" "The hallucinogenic compounds are primarily dermal secretions. The internal tissue would theoretically be less problematic." Marcus clapped his hands together with the enthusiasm of someone who had just received particularly good news. "Excellent. So, we're potentially looking at 3 new protein sources here. What's the muscle-to-chitin ratio on these things? Any idea about amino acid profiles?" The Felinian who had fainted earlier chose that moment to regain consciousness, took one look at the continuing conversation, and promptly fainted again. Professor Vex-Theta found himself caught in a situation no educator training had prepared him for. His carefully designed lesson on apex predator lethality had somehow transformed into what appeared to be an impromptu cooking show consultation. "Kane," he said, attempting to inject some authority back into his voice, "the point of this exercise is to understand the dangers these creatures represent. They are not potential menu items." "Oh, I totally get that," Marcus replied. "But understanding danger and understanding opportunity aren't mutually exclusive, right? I mean, humans have been turning dangerous things into dinner for thousands of years. It's kind of our specialty." A new voice piped up from the middle of the classroom. Zara Min, one of the Aquarian students, had apparently recovered enough to form coherent thoughts. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the warbling quality typical of her species. "But did you just say that humans regularly consume dangerous organisms?" Marcus turned to address her directly, his expression suggesting he was delighted to have found someone else interested in the topic. "Oh yeah, all the time. Poisonous mushrooms, toxic plants, venomous sea creatures, things that could kill you if you looked at them wrong. Half of human cuisine is basically, let's figure out how to eat this thing that wants to kill us." Zara Min's gills fluttered rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation in Aquarian physiology. "But why?" she asked. "Why would you deliberately consume dangerous organisms when safer alternatives exist?" Marcus shrugged, as if the answer was self-evident. "Because they usually taste really good. Also, there's a certain satisfaction in taking something that could kill you and turning it into dinner. It's like winning a really specific kind of argument." Professor Vex-Theta realized his lesson plan had been completely derailed. What should have been a straightforward presentation on lethal xenofauna had somehow become a seminar on human dietary adventurism. "Perhaps," he said, attempting to regain control, "we could return to the actual topic of today's lesson, which is survival strategies when encountering apex predators." Right, Marcus said. But isn't figuring out how to eat them potentially the ultimate survival strategy? I mean, if you can turn your predators into your prey, you've basically won the ecosystem game. The logic was so fundamentally twisted that it almost made sense, which Professor Vex-Theta found deeply disturbing. These creatures, he said, gesturing at the 3 containers, have evolved specifically to be as lethal as possible. They are perfect killing machines, honed by millions of years of evolution. So were sharks, Marcus replied, and we figured out how to make shark fin soup, though I personally think that's wasteful. You should use the whole shark if you're going to kill it. The classroom had achieved a level of quiet typically associated with deep space or recent battlefields. Everyone was staring at Marcus with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or particularly interesting forms of insanity. You know what would be really interesting, Marcus continued, apparently warming to his theme, is understanding the flavor profiles of organisms from different evolutionary backgrounds. Earth-based predators tend to have lean muscle tissue with concentrated flavor compounds. I wonder if that holds true for creatures from higher gravity worlds or different atmospheric compositions. Professor Vex-Theta felt reality beginning to slip slightly. His simple lesson on dangerous fauna had somehow evolved into what sounded like a graduate-level course in xenobiological gastronomy. The nightmare centipede, he heard himself saying, experiences atmospheric pressures 3 times standard Earth normal. That would probably make the muscle tissue denser, Marcus mused. More protein per unit weight. And the bioluminescent segments might indicate unique biochemical pathways. Could be interesting from a nutritional standpoint. A new student joined the conversation. Kex-9, a silicon-based life form from the Vega system, spoke in the sort of crystalline tones that suggested deep thoughtfulness. In my culture, Kex-9 said, we consume various forms of metallic compounds that would be lethal to carbon-based life forms. Perhaps the concept of dangerous cuisine is more universal than we assumed. Exactly, Marcus said, pointing at Kex-9 with enthusiasm. Every species probably has foods that would be deadly to others. It's just a matter of biological compatibility and proper preparation techniques. Professor Vex-Theta realized he had lost complete control of his classroom. What had started as a lesson on apex predator lethality had transformed into an impromptu cross-cultural exchange program focused on hazardous dining practices. Perhaps, he said weakly, we should schedule a follow-up session to explore these alternative perspectives on predator-prey relationships. The class period was nearly over anyway, and Professor Vex-Theta found himself desperately in need of whatever his species used for stress relief. Possibly alcohol. Definitely therapy. Marcus raised his hand again. Actually, Professor, he said, would it be possible to get tissue samples from these specimens? For analysis, I mean. I'd love to run some basic nutritional assessments. Professor Vex-Theta stared at the human student with something approaching existential horror. In the span of a single class period, his carefully prepared lesson on survival techniques had been completely subverted by a species that apparently viewed apex predators as potential appetizers. "Class dismissed," he announced, his voice carrying the hollow ring of educational defeat. As the students filed out, chattering excitedly about the unexpected direction the lesson had taken, Professor Vex-Theta remained at his desk, staring at the 3 containers of lethal fauna that had somehow been reclassified as potential cuisine. From the doorway, he heard Marcus Kane's voice carrying back into the classroom. I wonder if they have a xenobiology lab where we could do some actual cooking experiments. Professor Vex-Theta began to understand why so many educators eventually requested transfers to administrative positions. 3 days later, Professor Vex-Theta received the kind of emergency communication that made his exoskeleton itch with dread. The message, delivered via priority channel from Dean Quick's Alpha, contained exactly 7 words that spelled academic doom. Kane has requested access to the specimens. The professor's compound eyes twitched as he processed this information. In his nightmares, which had become significantly more vivid since Tuesday's class, he had imagined this exact scenario. The human student, with his disturbing enthusiasm for converting lethal organisms into potential meals, had apparently decided to move from theoretical discussion to practical application. Absolutely not, Vex-Theta muttered to his empty office, clicking his mandibles in what his species considered emphatic denial. Under no circumstances will I authorize that walking catastrophe to handle Class A hazardous specimens. His comm unit chimed again. Another message from the dean. Emergency faculty meeting. Conference room 7. Bring the specimens. Kane will be presenting his research proposal. Professor Vex-Theta's grip on his desk left permanent claw marks in the metal surface. The human hadn't just requested access to the specimens, he had gone directly to administration with a formal research proposal. The kind of administrative maneuvering that suggested either exceptional intelligence or complete insanity. Possibly both. 30 minutes later, Professor Vex-Theta found himself seated in Conference Room 7, surrounded by the most distinguished academic minds in the sector. Dean Quick's Alpha presided over the gathering with the sort of grave authority typically reserved for war crimes tribunals. The 3 specimen containers sat in the center of the conference table like accusations waiting to be heard. Marcus Kane entered the room carrying what appeared to be a comprehensive research portfolio, several data tablets, and something that looked suspiciously like cooking equipment. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus said, addressing the assembled faculty with the confidence of someone who had clearly never experienced appropriate levels of academic terror. "I know this is unusual, but I believe I've identified a significant opportunity that could revolutionize both xenobiology and interspecies nutrition science." Professor Vex-Theta felt his grip on reality wavering slightly. The human was treating this like a legitimate academic presentation rather than what it clearly was, a thinly veiled excuse to experiment with turning nightmare fuel into snack food. "Mr. Kane," Dean Quick's Alpha said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had silenced rebellions. "Please explain why you believe these Class A hazardous specimens should be reclassified for nutritional research." Marcus activated his presentation display with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a masterpiece. "Gladly, Dean. Over the past 72 hours, I've conducted extensive research into the biochemical profiles of organisms from high-stress environments. What I've discovered is fascinating." The first slide displayed a complex molecular diagram that looked like abstract art designed by someone with serious mental health issues. The Mordian death wasp possesses a protein structure that's approximately 30% more efficient than standard Earth-based equivalents. The amino acid profile includes several compounds that don't exist in our current nutritional databases. We're potentially looking at a completely novel protein source with applications for long-term space travel and colony development. Professor Vex-Theta stared at the presentation with growing horror. The human had actually done legitimate scientific analysis. Comprehensive, thoroughly researched, properly documented scientific analysis on organisms specifically designed by evolution to kill everything that looked at them wrong. Furthermore, Marcus continued, advancing to the next slide, preliminary chemical modeling suggests that the venom compounds, while lethal in their natural state, break down into harmless byproducts when exposed to specific temperature and pH conditions. Standard cooking procedures, essentially. Dr. Flim Beta, the head of the biochemistry department, leaned forward with obvious interest. Her crystalline form reflected the presentation lights in patterns that suggested scientific curiosity overriding survival instinct. "These models," she said, "have they been verified through actual testing?" "Limited testing only," Marcus replied. "I was able to obtain small, tissue samples from the Academy's waste disposal system after Professor Vex-Theta's demonstration. Nothing substantial enough for comprehensive analysis, but sufficient to confirm the basic biochemical pathways." Professor Vex-Theta's mandibles clicked involuntarily. The human had been scavenging specimen waste. Of course he had. The scorpion-spider hybrid presents even more interesting possibilities, Marcus continued, clearly warming to his topic. The muscle tissue contains trace amounts of rare earth elements that could provide essential nutrients for silicon-based life forms. We're talking about potential dietary supplements for multiple species classifications. Kex 9, who had somehow managed to secure a position as a guest observer, chimed in with obvious enthusiasm. "This could address the nutritional deficiencies my people experience during extended space missions," she said. "Our current supplement protocols are expensive and inefficient." Marcus nodded eagerly. "Exactly. And the nightmare centipede might be the most promising of all. The bioluminescent compounds appear to be concentrated sources of complex organic molecules that could serve as natural antioxidants. We're potentially looking at anti-aging properties, enhanced immune response, possibly even cellular regeneration enhancement." The room had gone completely silent. Every faculty member was staring at the presentation, with expressions ranging from fascination to existential crisis. Dean Quix Alpha spoke first. "Mr. Kane," she said slowly, "are you suggesting that these specimens, currently classified as apex predators, too dangerous for standard containment protocols, should be reclassified as potential food sources?" "Not immediately," Marcus replied. "I'm suggesting we conduct proper scientific research to determine their viability as sustainable protein sources, with appropriate safety protocols, naturally." Professor Vex-Theta found his voice returning, though it came out at a pitch that suggested his vocal cords were experiencing their own existential crisis. "These creatures have wiped out entire colonies," he protested. "The Mordian death wasp alone has a kill count measured in the thousands." "So did cattle," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "And sharks, and about half the things humans consider standard dinner options. The key is understanding the risk-to-benefit ratio and developing appropriate handling procedures." Dr. Nim Gamma, the head of the safety department, had been reviewing Marcus's data with the sort of intense concentration that suggested either deep scientific interest or advanced mental breakdown. "The safety protocols outlined here," she said, "are actually quite comprehensive. Multiple redundant containment systems, specialized handling equipment, controlled environment processing. This appears to be legitimate scientific methodology." Professor Vex-Theta felt the room slipping away from him. His colleagues, distinguished academics, who should know better, were actually considering the human's proposal as if it were reasonable rather than completely insane. "What about the psychological impact?" he asked desperately. "These creatures are specifically designed to trigger fear responses across multiple species. They're nightmare fuel, given physical form." Marcus pulled up another slide showing what appeared to be taste test results. Interestingly, preliminary sensory analysis suggests that proper preparation significantly reduces the psychological impact. When presented as prepared food rather than live specimens, test subjects showed dramatically reduced stress responses. "You conducted taste tests?" Dean Kix Alpha asked, her voice climbing several octaves. "Very limited ones," Marcus admitted. "Just basic flavor and texture analysis using synthetic analogs. Nothing involving actual consumption of the specimens. Yet." The word "yet" hung in the air like a threat wrapped in academic curiosity. Professor Vex-Theta realized his colleagues were actually nodding along with the presentation. Nodding, as if the humans' proposal to turn their most dangerous specimens into potential cuisine was somehow reasonable. "The economic implications alone," Dr. Flim-Beta said, "could be revolutionary. If these organisms can be safely cultivated and processed, we're looking at entirely new industries, specialized restaurants, nutritional supplement production, maybe even luxury food markets for species with adventure-seeking dietary preferences." "Adventure-seeking dietary preferences," Professor Vex-Theta repeated weakly. "Think about it," Marcus said, clearly excited by the growing interest. "Humans aren't the only species that enjoys culinary challenges. The Klingon Empire has built entire cultural traditions around dangerous food. The Rigelians consider poisonous fungi a delicacy. There's definitely a market for this kind of thing." Dean Kix Alpha looked around the conference table, taking in the expressions of her faculty. What she saw apparently convinced her that the galaxy had officially lost its collective mind. "Mr. Kane," she said, "what exactly are you requesting from this institution?" Marcus straightened in his chair with the bearing of someone about to request something completely reasonable. "I'd like permission to establish a controlled research environment where these specimens can be studied from a nutritional perspective. Nothing dangerous, just basic biochemical analysis, preparation technique development, and small-scale safety testing." "You want to cook them?" Professor Vex-Theta said flatly. "I want to research optimal preparation methods for potential future consumption," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference." "No," Professor Vex-Theta said. "There really isn't." Dean Kix Alpha raised a hand for silence. The room immediately complied, which was impressive considering half the beings present didn't actually possess hearing organs. "This proposal," she said, "represents either groundbreaking scientific innovation or the first step toward Academy-sponsored suicide. Possibly both." She paused, looking directly at Marcus, with an expression that suggested she was calculating the odds of institutional survival. "However," she continued, "the potential benefits outlined in your research are compelling. The nutritional applications for long-term space exploration alone could justify the risk." Professor Vex-Theta felt his worldview crumbling like poorly constructed architecture. "Dean," he said, "you can't possibly be considering authorizing this madness." "I'm considering authorizing controlled scientific research with appropriate safety oversight," she replied. "Mr. Kane's proposal includes comprehensive risk mitigation strategies and potential benefits that could revolutionize interspecies nutrition science." Marcus beamed with the enthusiasm of someone who had just received permission to pursue his life's work. "Excellent! I've already identified several potential research assistants who are interested in the project. Zara Min from Aquarian Studies has experience with toxic marine organisms, and Kex-9 understands silicon-based biochemistry better than anyone in the sector." "Wait," Professor Vex-Theta said. "Other students are involved in this?" "Well, obviously," Marcus replied. "This kind of interdisciplinary research requires multiple perspectives. We're potentially revolutionizing an entire field of study. It's going to take teamwork." The conference room door chimed, and Zara Min entered carrying what appeared to be her own research portfolio. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her gills fluttering with excitement. I was finishing the preliminary analysis on aquatic toxin neutralization techniques. The results are fascinating. She was followed by Kex-9, who had somehow acquired a collection of crystalline analysis equipment that looked suspiciously advanced for standard student use. The mineral content analysis is complete, Kex-9 announced. These organisms contain trace elements that could address nutritional deficiencies across 17 different species classifications. Professor Vex-Theta stared at the three students with dawning horror. They had formed some kind of academic conspiracy focused on turning his carefully maintained nightmare specimens into an interdisciplinary research project. "How long?" he asked weakly. "Have you been planning this?" "Since Tuesday's class," Marcus admitted. "The potential was too obvious to ignore. We started comparing notes immediately after the lesson." Dean Quix Alpha looked around the conference room, taking in the assembled students, faculty, and specimens that had somehow transformed from objects of terror into subjects of legitimate scientific inquiry. "Very well," she said. "I'm authorizing a limited research program under strict safety protocols. Professor Vex-Theta will serve as primary oversight, given his expertise with these particular specimens." "I will not," Professor Vex-Theta said immediately. "You will," Dean Quix Alpha replied, with the sort of administrative finality that brooked no argument. "Consider it professional development." Marcus clapped his hands together with delight. "This is going to be amazing! I've already sketched out preparation techniques for all three specimens. We'll start with basic tissue analysis, move on to toxin neutralization procedures, then work our way up to actual consumption testing." "Consumption testing," Professor Vex-Theta repeated, his voice hollow with academic defeat. "Very small scale, initially," Marcus assured him. "Just enough to verify safety and basic palatability. Though I have to admit, I'm really curious about the flavor profiles. Earth-based predators tend to have very distinctive tastes depending on their primary diet and environmental stressors." Professor Vex-Theta realized that somewhere in the span of a single week, his orderly academic life had been completely derailed by a human student with an unhealthy interest in turning lethal organisms into potential appetizers. "There is one small detail I should mention," Marcus said, pulling out a final data tablet. "I may have already submitted a proposal to the Galactic Culinary Institute for a collaborative research grant. They're very interested in expanding the boundaries of interspecies cuisine." The silence that followed this announcement was the kind typically associated with the heat death of the universe. "You did what?" Dean Quix Alpha asked. "Well, if we're going to do this properly, we need proper funding," Marcus explained. "The Culinary Institute has substantial resources for this kind of innovative research. Plus, they have connections with restaurant chains across 17 systems. If our research proves successful, we could be looking at commercial applications within a standard galactic year." Professor Vex-Theta slowly lowered his head to the conference table with a soft thunk. "I'm going to need so much therapy," he muttered. From somewhere above his head, he heard Marcus's voice, bright with enthusiasm and completely oblivious to the cosmic horror he had unleashed. "This is going to revolutionize everything. Just wait until we start testing flavor enhancement techniques. I wonder if any of these things would taste good with garlic." Professor Vex-Theta began to understand why the universe was supposedly expanding. It was trying to get away from conversations like this one. 3 months later, the Academy's first interdisciplinary xenobiological cuisine research program would open to students from across the galaxy. The program would be wildly successful, revolutionize interspecies nutrition science, and establish Marcus Kane as the foremost expert in hazardous organism preparation techniques. Professor Vex-Theta would eventually request a transfer to theoretical mathematics, where the worst thing students could do was divide by zero. The specimens, meanwhile, would achieve something no apex predator in galactic history had ever accomplished. They would become the foundation of a sustainable farming industry, providing nutrition and employment opportunities across multiple star systems. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't the creature trying to kill you. It's the human trying to figure out what you taste like.